15 to 15 able-bodied males. They would take them on the pretext of questioning them, and again, no one saw them again. Obviously, they were massacred. After that, I was left with women, and children, and very old men. Now, they were marched out in long caravans to the south, constantly to the south, and from every part, from around the capital, suburbs of the capital, from all this area, all slowly coming down this way and gathering in the Syrian desert, a desert called Deir ez-Zor. And what this resulted in the context of Armenian history, is that for the first time, historic Armenian lands didn't have any Armenians on them. Before, they had lost independence, they had their fortunes had waxed and waned, but they always had people on the land. Now, the land was empty. All that was left was barren. Half of the population, more than 60% was Turkish and Kurdish at the time. That's all that remained. The 60% of the Muslim population remained. After the war, in 1919, the world gathered in Paris to write up a peace, which turned out to be the Peace of Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Armenians sent two delegations there. Two delegations because of this. Armenia was split before the war, Russian Armenian and Turkish Armenian. In May of 1918, taking advantage of the fact that Turkey was losing, that Russia had withdrawn as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, all the Russian troops had gone north to help Lenin defeat the forces, the counter-revolutionary forces that were trying to take away the power he had gained. This area was left in a military vacuum. The Armenians were able to form a state called the Republic of Armenia in May of 1918. When the peace conference in Paris began in spring of 1919, the Armenians had already expanded. The Republic was proclaimed only on Russian Armenian land. 1 year afterwards, in May 1919, this Armenian government expanded up to about here. They took the regions of Kars and Ardahan, which before the war, in 1914, had been in the Russian Empire. So again, the Republic of Armenia was like this. The size was like this. Was on former Russian territory, former Russian Armenian territory. Now, this government had a claim against the rest of the state. They claimed this as, much, as historic Armenia, and they wanted it next to the Republic of Armenia. They sent a delegation led by a poet, old revolutionary, his name was Armenian. They sent him to Paris to negotiate with his demands. The Western Armenians, who considered themselves different, they spoke a different dialect, they were a different people, it was not one nation, and they considered themselves a separate nation. So these Armenians, the Western Armenians, sent a delegation under a very conservative leadership, which had been, this leadership, had been an enemy of the party that was governing Armenia, the Republic of Armenia. So these delegations went to Paris with conflicting ideas. The Western Armenians, led by this man named Boğaz Murat Pasha, who was a very smooth politician, but it seems to me he lost his perception, his political perception, when he made a demand to the Europeans. He demanded all this. A huge Armenia like this, from sea to sea. The Republic of Armenian government said it's unrealistic, and if we ask for too much, they won't give us anything. Finally, they agreed to demand the whole thing, because at that time, sympathy for Armenians was so widespread throughout the world. Nobody, if you went anywhere, if you went to Australia, you said, what should the Armenians have? They would say anything they want, because the experience of the genocide was fresh in the minds of the whole world. The press was constantly told Armenian genocide, Armenian genocide. At that time it wasn't called genocide, but the term was, the name was turned later. Armenian atrocities, Armenian massacres, deportation massacres, constantly. So Armenians thought logically that why not ask for all this? We fought on the side of the Allies won. Why should we not get this? While these two delegations are in Paris, something else is happening. The former Turkish leaders are approaching the Armenians and saying, not the leaders who masterminded the genocide, former officials who were high up in the Ottoman Turkish government, they began approaching the Armenians and saying, listen, let's let bygones be bygones, and let's negotiate. Don't go to the Europeans, we'll give you something. We'll make a deal here. We'll give you a country, you deserve it. But the Armenians now became arrogant. Why? Why accept this? Why negotiate with the loser when you were fighting on the side of the winner? So they rejected all these approaches. The former Turkish leaders, all these approaches for reconciliation, they rejected them. And in hindsight, it looks foolish because had they accepted it, things might not have turned out the way it did. But at that time, no Armenian in his right mind would talk to a Turkish official and try to make a deal with him, because he thought, I have America on my side, I have France on my side, I have Britain on my side, Italy on my side. Now, it turned out that all the promises that the Europeans lavished on the Armenians over the years, during the 1895-1896 massacres, throughout that period up to World War I, they said, we'll help you, you're our little ally, this, that, all these promises amounted to nothing when certain considerations came to the fore. Europe was involved in European problems. They were concerned primarily with Germany. Germany was their enemy. Turkey seemed distant to them, and Turkey seemed backward. They had a racist, negative attitude toward the Turks. They said, well, who cares about it? If we destroy their army, it's going to take them a long time to recover. And what was left of Turkey before World War I, it was like this, roughly like this, huge area. By the peace of 1919, by Treaty of Versailles, it was reduced to this, exactly to present-day Turkey. It was reduced to that. The section of the treaty that dealt with Armenia was deferred. They didn't settle it in Paris because, frankly, they didn't know what to do with it. All the European powers, President Woodrow Wilson, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, they were all frankly embarrassed with the Armenian problem. They couldn't go back on their word because they were on record as saying this, that. Some of the quotes are just delicious. All these French premier said, we intend to settle the fate of the Armenian people according to the dictates of humanity, something like that. Very noble, very grandiose statements. They were on record. But they knew that to help Armenia take these lands, they would have to fight the Turks. The Turks were still there. The Turks still had armies moving around, unorganized, but they still had armies moving around. And now there was beginning to form, right over here, Erzurum, a Turkish nationalist resistance movement. The empire had fallen, but now a resistance movement under a nationalist named Mustafa Kemal began to be formed, and by early 1920 he had about 40,000 troops in this area. The Greeks at this time had advanced up to about here. The Greeks wanted part of Turkey too. Armenians wanted part of Turkey, Greeks wanted part of Turkey. So it became obvious that to take this land and give it to Armenia, you would have to fight 40,000 Turks. Now the European powers were in no condition to do that. They had a physical capability, but at that time their population was suffering from war weariness. They had They had no stomach for war. Everybody was saying, let the boys come home. And you might be familiar with some of the literature, the post-World War I period, and a campaign in a distant eastern country was not going to be popular with the voters. The treaty involving Armenia was signed in Sèvres, in the city, French city of Sèvres, in 1920. After negotiating throughout spring of 1920, it was signed on August 10th, 1920. And this is what that treaty did. By the way, America did not participate in these negotiations for this treaty, for the Eastern Treaty. They participated only at Versailles when it involved Europe. What this Treaty of Versailles of 1920 said, with Armenia, the Republic of Armenia is recognized as an independent country. Now this was the first time in approximately 600 years that Armenia is recognized formally as a government. And it's given title to any territory that President Woodrow Wilson wants to give them. So the Europeans put it on the Americans' lap. They didn't know what to do with it. They were embarrassed. They didn't want to just give Armenia that land and say, go take it, because they were afraid that another Armenian massacre would take place. One interesting thing happened in these negotiations. At one point, when the Armenian delegates were talking to the European leaders, the European leaders said, but can you really take this land? And the Armenians said, oh sure, of course we can. If you help us build an army of 40,000, we can take it. And the British, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister David Lloyd George said, well, what if you can't take it? Won't they massacre all the Armenians there? And the Armenian delegate, Boghos Nubar Pasha, said, well, there are no Armenians there. There were over 1 million had been massacred. Whoever was not massacred was down here. Arabian deserts were down here. There were no Armenians left. And that was the crux of the problem. Because at that time, Woodrow Wilson was talking about a term called self-determination. He was saying every people have a right to determine their own future on their land. Now, what the Turks were saying is, how can President Wilson want to give Armenians this much land when there are no Armenians there? There are only Turks there. So they were twisting it around. And Armenians were arguing that, of course, there are no Armenians there now, but they're not there because of genocide. And if you don't go back to 1914, when there were Armenians there, you're condoning genocide. Well, it didn't matter. All these semantics didn't matter. What it was, the whole point was to take this land. Armenia had to fight, and Armenia was in no condition to fight. The country was full of about 300,000 refugees. There was no food. The conditions were miserable. They couldn't stay alive, let alone wage a campaign into these lands. So what the Europeans did in this treaty, they transferred the responsibility. They passed the buck to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson sat down and he drew up a boundary. It was a huge 200-page report on this boundary, and it's a very detailed study done by the State Department. And it gave Armenia, it awarded Armenia all the lands from here, roughly like this. In other words, half of what Armenians had wanted, and certainly all of solid historic Armenian land. This is the area where the Armenian kingdom had originated. This was solidly Armenian. When you get over here, it becomes more earthwork. But again, it was too late. Armenians had this land on paper by treaty, and the Turkish government signed this treaty. But what good is a treaty when you can't put it into effect with an army? In October of 1920, Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish nationalist leader, saw his opportunity. He was smart. He saw that the Greeks were coming here, and this is all that was left of Turkey was a small piece. he couldn't fight the Greeks and the Armenians at the same time, and he came to the conclusion that fighting the Armenians first would be better because they're weaker. And he was smart enough to know that the Europeans are not going to help the Armenians. At this time, the Russian Civil War was just about over. By late 1920, the Russian Civil War, that is the war of the Bolsheviks against the forces, against the conservative forces, against the armies of the white Russians, they had come down here. They had taken control of Azerbaijan, which was a republic next to Armenia. To the other side of Armenia was the Republic of Georgia. These three republics were independent. The Russians took over Azerbaijan in summer of 1920. In fall of 1920, Mustafa Kemal attacks. He doesn't recognize the treaty. The treaty was he disregards it. He said it was signed by the representatives of the previous government. Now he is forming a new government, and I don't recognize the treaty. He attacks Armenia, and in 2 months, the Armenian army collapses. They had about an army of 20,000. And all the military experts agreed that Armenia would need an army of 40,000 to ward off the Turkish forces and possibly take over this land. So when do we have? In 2 months, the Armenian army collapsed, and the Turkish forces occupied about 60% of the country. Now, the Bolshevik forces were on the other side of the border, and they began approaching the Armenians and saying, this is the Bolshevik Armenians approaching, saying that if you let the Russian troops enter, we'll make sure that Turks don't take all of the country. We'll have something left. And again, I'm simplifying it, but that's essentially what happened. Because before the Turks had attacked, Mustafa Kemal had made a deal an informal deal with Lenin. And by that deal, they did what had been done to Armenia in 387 AD, between Rome and Persia. It was partition. Again, when they saw that Armenia, when big powers, it's the same theme running throughout Armenian history. When two big powers see Armenia coalescing into something, into a force, they want to partition it, they want to destroy it. So in winter of 1921, a treaty is written. By the way, the Russian troops were allowed to come in. The government of the Republic of Armenia had no choice, because the Turks could impose any treaty they wanted at that point. The Russian troops came in, and as a result of that, the Turks were forced to, Turkish nationalists were forced to make some type of concession, and they really didn't have to because they had conquered Armenia outright. The Turkish nationalists had taken roughly this much of Armenia. They agreed to withdraw across this area where the Kingdom of Mani is. They agreed to withdraw. There's a small river called Arpachai River running here, and Turkey now remained on that side, and here was proclaimed Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1921. And the status of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic is the same as the other republics within the Soviet Union. There is considerable internal autonomy. Armenian language is used. There is considerable cultural autonomy, but the crucial things do not exist. Armenia can't print its own money, doesn't have a foreign policy, and doesn't have its own army. And the Armenian troops are connected to Soviet troops, Soviet contingents, which are placed in Europe or Siberia, but not in the Caucasus, not in large numbers. And that's the status of Soviet Armenia. As for the other lands in Turkey, they've remained desolate until now. If you go there, it's an eerie feeling because you see all these old abandoned churches, abandoned monuments.
farmlands that have been barren for decades. The area has not been repopulated. It's always been a barren area from the beginning. But once the Armenians left, it's regressed. The land has regressed, and when we consider how crowded various parts of the world are, we talk about the population problem. Here, there's vast expanses of land that are being unused, uncultivated. Within Soviet Armenia, there's one thing some of you might be interested in because you're experiencing it today. There's a migration now out of Soviet Armenia. That is because of there's nothing Armenian about it. It's a Soviet-wide thing. Soviet Russians would migrate if they could, just like Soviet Jews migrate. Soviet Armenians migrate because of a liberalized immigration policy now. And they migrate because of the Soviet system that we're familiar with. There's no need to go into that. But now it creates a problem that there had been created a diaspora. After the deportations and massacres of World War I, there was created an Armenian diaspora, which the center of which was in Lebanon. There are Armenians scattered throughout Middle Eastern lands. Beirut was a center, and Persia was another center. And Armenians also went throughout Europe, America, wherever you go in the world, you'll find an Armenian colony. Almost everywhere you'll find an Armenian community, large or small. In 1948, Armenians were encouraged by the Soviet government to come back to Armenia because it was created a serious internal problem. The Republic of Armenia was pressured by Azerbaijan and by Georgia for lands. There were territorial claims against each other. And the excuse given by the Azerbaijanis and by the Georgians was that there aren't enough Armenians here. We're giving Armenians too much credit, they have too much for their numbers. So the Soviet Armenian government began a campaign to entice Armenians from the Middle East and indeed from all over the world to come back to Soviet Armenia for two reasons. As a propaganda thing against the West, to say that, see, we have citizens, we have people coming into the Soviet Union. They don't just they don't just escape the Berlin Wall. See, some are even coming in. That was one purpose. Another purpose was to strengthen Soviet Armenia population-wise, because within Soviet Armenia there are Turks and there are a lot of Kurds, and it was felt that a population transfer from the Middle East would be beneficial, and it would. Well, now what you witness coming out now are those repatriates who had gone in 47, 48. They are the ones who are coming out now, because a Soviet Armenian citizen born in Armenia has a much harder time coming out, if at all. It's very difficult. But if you're a repatriate, if you came after World War II, there's a good possibility of being allowed to immigrate. And there are interesting social reasons why. The repatriates were regarded by the Soviets as an unhealthy influence on the people born there, because when they came in 48, don't forget, for 25 years, Armenia had been ruled by Soviets. During those 25 years, these Armenians had seen Beirut, had seen Damascus, had seen the West. A lot of them had been to Europe. Now they come to Soviet Armenia and expecting all these promises. All this that they came, what do they see? Rocks, dust, poverty, famine. Of course, they want to leave. Once you're there, you want to leave. And no, you're there. So they stayed 25 years. And now people coming out feel that they did their duty. And there's friction among Armenians. A lot of Armenians resent the fact that other Armenians are leaving the homeland and coming here, coming anywhere. They say you should stay in your homeland. And the response of those people there is that we went for 25 years, we worked our fingers to the bone, literally, we worked their fingers to the bone, And why don't you go there and pitch in for a while, build up something. We did enough, we suffered enough, and they want a better life for their children. So the Armenian situation in Soviet Armenia is not secure, because there's an attempt, there's always this pressure, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, this pressure of Russian domination, this ominous threat of the Russian language, of the Russian culture encroaching. There used to be times when an Armenian store in Armenia, the sign on the store would be Armenian on top and Russian on the bottom. And so they changed to Russian on top, Armenian on the bottom. And now often in various buildings you can see only Russian. So Armenians are very sensitive to that, to their language, to their culture, and they feel threatened. It's a mild threat, but they feel threatened. Because of the oppression in Soviet Armenia, Armenians look upon Beirut as a bastion of an area where Armenians could retain their identity and be exposed to the outside and could prosper financially. Now we know what's happening in Beirut. The Armenians are being pressured out of there by the Christian elements. And again, it's within Lebanon. Again, it's the same story throughout Armenian history. Armenia is small. In this case, it's 200,000, 250,000 Armenians in a country of about 3 million. And they're caught between the two sides. Again, same thing. The Palestinians and the Muslim Armenians, as opposed to the Christian Muslim Lebanese, as opposed to the Christian Lebanese. The Christian Lebanese, for years, have been asking the Armenians to join them. You're Christian after all. Armenians won't dare join because they feel neutrality is the safest way. They feel too small to fight one side or the other. So because they're not joining the Christians are taking out on the Armenians and saying either you join us, or we're going to throw you out of the country. And indeed, that's what's happening. In addition to the Soviet Armenians coming here, a lot of them are coming from Lebanon. In Persia, a similar story. With the overthrow of the Shah, who was a friend of the Armenians, so-called friend, because the Persian Armenians were a very wealthy element, and they were supporting the Shah. Here, when you used to see demonstrations about down with the Shah, down with the fascist pig, or the leadership of the Armenian community in Persia was aligned with the Shah. The Shah was giving them religious autonomy, some cultural autonomy, and the Armenians are very good. They have a reputation, which is probably deserved, of being good businessmen, and they were serving the Shah very well, and the Shah was serving them. Now, with the Shah gone and the country, Iran, becoming an Islamic republic, it puts the Armenians in a very precarious position because they're Christian. The Jews are in a precarious position because they're Jews. So what's happening now is Armenians from Persia are also leaving, which is why we have Persian Armenian students here also. So from the 3 places that Armenians have a foothold today, they're being for various reasons, they're being forced out. And so the future for the Armenians today looks dismal, and sometimes you see children who appear to have complexes. If you see Armenians who appear to have complexes, it's because of this constant, they feel like something is behind them, constantly pushing. They have an apprehensive feeling of something being behind them and of time being against them, time being their enemy. Okay, thank you. If you have any questions, I cut it short, so if you have any questions, I hope it makes sense because it's.
I see a similarity because of the type of terrain, because of their long-standing tradition of neutrality between Switzerland and Armenia. Why do you think Switzerland has been able to maintain its borders and maintain neutrality, whereas Armenia never could?
Mm-hmm. Switzerland's feudal tradition is in the European sense, whereas there was a king. They were able to have a monarch that was able to rally around him the loyalty of the nobility. the Armenian monarchy never could. And one reason for that was the lack of a written language. And don't forget, the Armenian language came about, the written language, in 400 AD, 406 AD. All this time, the Armenians have been pulled from various cultures. The Swiss is different because the powers around them were never much bigger than the Swiss. They were bigger. France was bigger. Germany was bigger. There was a difference. Look how much bigger powers Armenians were faced with. The Roman Empire. Switzerland was never faced with a Roman on one side and the Persian Empire on the other. And that's the basic difference. But again, in history, a lot of sequences of events lead to an outcome. One thing that made the Armenians more dangerous than the Swiss is that at one time they tried to form an empire, and that woke up the eyes of. That woke them up. As long as the Swiss stayed up there, they never really got big. They never were really a threat, and they weren't an expansive people. The Armenians, because they were in commerce, although their kingdom was here, they had Armenians here, India, everywhere. So they appeared more dangerous. That's as close as.
Levon, you also mentioned that when the people that left in 1915 were why haven't the Turkish people built on those lands? It's interesting, since that is a fertile land.
Right,
Is it I'd like to hear superstition.
Well,
I'm wondering, this is what
among some superstition, there's some Armenians like to say that the bones of all the hundreds of thousands of Armenians are, if you plow, your plow's going to break and hit you, there are things like that. But and some Turks in that area, Kurds in that area certainly believe that. In fact, there are some Turks and Kurds interviewed who say, too bad they threw the Armenians out. When the Armenians were here, this is like a 90-year-old, 100-year-old Kurd speaking. When the Armenians were here, we always had enough to eat. We always knew where to attack, to take grain or this or that. We always, it was prosperous here. With the Armenians gone, everything looks so depressing. So there is an element of truth in that superstition. But the main reason why it's not being used, that land, is because of the larger economic situation that Turkey is in. Turkey just cannot afford the army she has. She has a 500,000 man army, and their industrial strength is very weak. They're forced to borrow on the international market. They don't have the capital to exploit that land over here. It would take immense capital, immense agricultural technology, modern technology to exploit that land, and Turkey doesn't have it, and Turkey can't invest in it because of various internal economic problems, political problems, and because of this huge army they have that they have to feed. And this army is a formidable army. The Soviet Union would not dare attack Turkey without thinking twice. Even though the U.S. is an ally of Turkey, without the U.S. helping Turkey, Turkey has a fantastic army, immense military power, and to keep this going, to keep this modern machinery going, they have to take it from somewhere else. And basically where they're taking it from is the east. That part is not being developed. All they have there is, I think, 2 hydroelectric plants in these areas. They're developing areas that are easier to reach, over here. Turkey is so backward economically that they can develop there are so many spots they can develop before they go to the east. And the Turkish population from the east is moving to the cities for jobs. It's a migration we see in America from the farms to the cities for jobs. And that's why the land is desolate. It's never recovered from that deportation.
You gave a fantastic overview. And the thing I just, starting with the history, if you're working with the Armenian child, one thing that I feel, I could be projecting, but I really think there's some element of truth in there. For the kids that we get, the, in quotes, good student to the one that seems to be somewhat disoriented, they have a psyche that has this foreboding feeling that this overview that went on here. I don't think there are very many Armenian children that don't have that pressure of their history, sitting right here on their heads. We have left the homeland. That's a problem. That might not be this conscious subject, but this overview that he has got, he's been in so much information that I haven't known up on that. It's hard to get the Armenian history in English. Maybe you can have a fantastic overview of it. But even as a kid, not knowing hardly, knowing very much about history instead, I think my father was. You never look, a day doesn't go by that some incident doesn't happen in the home that is, a reference is made to it. Now these kids coming from whichever country they're coming from today, it again gets that, the exile out. I again do not think that there are many that are leaving with a positive feeling that they're, coming here. In other words, they're coming reluctantly. They're coming to a safe spot for survival only. And when you're coming reluctantly, when you're leaving something, it's like you're being pushed away. And I hope that as the what do we have, 13 sessions left, as we talk more about the Armenian child in school, that you will always keep in mind this history. And I think you proportioned your lecture, I think, very well. Your last part was, the present history. But before that, we did have, I think, quite an elaborate, we have, our churches out in their history to realize we are an old people. And we have this culture behind us. We have quite an ethnic cultural history behind it. Then we have this present thing over our heads, and then the situation today with the kids coming, and from the various countries that they're coming. I know that my father asked, everyone that he meets, why are you here? Why did you, And the answer is, brother, I did my duty, now you do your duty, and we understand. We would go. I would go to a free independent Armenia, but I wouldn't go to the situation that exists today. So among us, they're living in the same important contexts here. So you have to understand, superimposed upon the bilingual immigrant child, he didn't leave because, father is getting a better job here in the United States.
It's important to distinguish between an Armenian immigrant and the immigrant tides that the United States has seen over the years, because the U.S. was built by immigrants, but immigrants who wanted to come, who voluntarily came. Of course, they were persecuted, they had reasons to come, but they didn't, it was different in the Armenian sense that the other immigrants that came had a country back there. They had something, and they left it for family reasons, personal reasons, for economic reasons, for a better life. The difference with the Armenian experience is that they were forced out. They were grabbed by the neck, killed, or forced out. And every other country they come from is always pushing, they're persecuted. That's why they're out. People aren't coming from Lebanon just to have two cars. Most of them are coming because they're being killed. Same in Persia. Now, Armenians are westernized. They adapt to Western culture very quickly. They're westernized, and that's why in Persia they're experiencing such oppression now, because they are westernized, and there's a law that men and women can't go swimming in the same pool or on the same beach. They have to have separate days now. That's a new law that was that Khomeini passed about 2 months ago. That I don't know if it rescinded. Now, for the Persians, that's okay. The Armenians, they're used to the West, and they can't understand that. Wine is forbidden by Khomeini. The Armenians use wine in their church services. In an Islamic republic, there's no, okay, you can have your church, but using wine, that's going too far. See, so all these things, and more serious things than that, are forcing the Armenians out to here. Any other questions? Such a wide, such a long time span. If you get lost any time along the way, feel free to ask any questions to orient yourself. A lot of this material is new to you, and because I'm condensing it, it's going to be harder to follow. First, I'll just say something about the geography of Armenia.
Historically, Armenia is located roughly at this area. What I mean by historic is, at some point in history, all of these lands, including here, up to Palestine, all of these lands at some point were ruled by Armenians. But not, obviously not all of it at one time, except for a short period. And the Armenians originated here in Central Asia. They were Indo-European people, and 3,000 years before Christ, in the movement, mass movement of humanity toward Europe. That's why they called Indo-European. Around 2000 BC, they formed here an empire called the Hittite Empire. It stretched roughly like this. Now the Armenians were a tribe in the Hittite Empire, and there were two groups, two Armenian tribes. One was called the Hayasa, which had come from here, around 1300 BC. The others were the Armenians, different tribe, who had come here with the Hittites, they were part of the Hittite Empire, and they split off. Around 1000 BC, they split off and started moving east. When they got here, they found that there was already a civilization, or already a country on these lands, on the current Armenian lands. That was called the state of Urartu. That lasts from 870 to 590 BC. So while the state of Urartu, which consisted of 50 kingdoms, they were also referred to as the kings of Naidi. The whole area was called Naidi by the Assyrians. At this time, it was called the Assyrian Empire. It was down here. Hittite Empire and Assyrian. In 590 BC, Urartu fell to the Median Empire, formed here. It fell to the Median Empire and their Armenian allies. So this one tribe, the Armenian Shukriya, settled here, helped the Medes overthrow the Urartu kingdom, and now the Armenians went into this area called Urartu and began to impose their language on the people. Urartu had a different language, the Armenians had Indo-European language. In the course of centuries, the language merged and the Indo-European element dominated. The Armenian language we have today is a combination of Urartu and Indo-European and a mixture of languages from other peoples. The whole region. So between 1200 and 700 BC, the Armenian nation formed. But it was not independent, just a nation, one nation among many others with this large empire. In 560 BC, the first Armenian dynasty was established by a man called Levon. And he established the Levantian dynasty, but again, it wasn't completely independent kingdom. It was under the suzerainty of empire to the east and what was left of the Hittite Empire to the west. This situation lasted, you call this a semi-independent, semi-autonomous situation. This lasted to 324 BC, when the country for the first time was split. And you're going to see throughout this 3,000 years, you're going to see Armenia constantly being split into two, which is why you can't see Armenia on the map now, because it was constantly being divided. This situation, the divided and the petty king within the minor empire, lasted until 190 BC. And this is when the first solid Armenian dynasty was established in the first period of total independence. This was called the Artashes dynasty, and it lasted almost 200 years. All during this time, Armenia was absorbing all the peoples around it. Everyone they came in contact with, they absorbed. The country, which had originally been the remnants of the Urartu state, was restricted to here. Slowly, the kings of Armenia started expanding, mainly northward. What you have here right now is modern-day Soviet Armenia. As you can see, Soviet Armenia was always on the periphery of historic Armenian lands. Armenia started expanding this way, in all directions. And soon, they became a threat to the larger states. As long as they were small here, they were left to be petty kingdoms, autonomous, independent, whatever, as long as they stayed in their mountains. What happened around 90 BC is that one king, his name was Dikran II, one king had the audacity to begin expanding. At this time, the Roman Empire was to the west, Persian Empire was to the east. This king began expanding, and he reached almost to the Black Sea. He reached almost to the Caspian Sea over here. Northern Iran was in Armenia. He expanded all the way southward, and all the way down, all the way to the Sinai. And this was around 80 BC. So he had been 10 years on the throne. In 10 years, had expanded the small Armenian state into his huge empire. The one thing interesting about his empire is that he didn't try to impose the Armenian culture on the peoples they conquered. He left the areas most to themselves, kept their customs, kept their institutions, and he governed through governorships. And this is different from most of the empires we're used to, where they control, they govern the area directly. Around 66 AD, something interesting happened. When Rome saw how big this Armenian king had become, when they saw that the Armenian king declared himself king of kings, in other words, an emperor, the Roman emperor got upset. Now this is getting a little bit too much. He sent, in 66 AD, he sent an expedition, Rome sent an expedition,
Which map is better? This one is better.
he sent an expedition to Armenia, reach up to here. The king, the Armenian king at this time, was in Palestine. At the king's court was the king's father-in-law, called Mithridates, who was the king of the Greek Pontic kingdom, right up here. This man had waged war against Rome, had lost, and he had taken refuge in the Armenian court. The Romans demanded that the Armenian king give this king up. He couldn't because it was his father-in-law. And for other political reasons, for mostly family, for political and family reasons, he wouldn't give him up. At which time the Roman troops attacked, they destroyed the capital of Tigan II, the capital here, which is close to Diyarbakir. It's called Diyarbakir. They reduced it. At this time, Tigan, down here, went up to defend it. It was too late, and he retreated with his father-in-law into these areas. All the time, when Armenian kings were faced with trouble, they would retreat up into the mountains where they felt safe. This battle went on and on for about 10 years, after which Tigan lost by 60 AD. After a 10-year battle, he had lost, and he gave up the title of King of Kings. But the Romans were so impressed by the size of their army, were so impressed by the organization of the Armenian state, that they decided not to incorporate it into the Roman Empire. Now, this is the first time the Roman Empire did this. Before 60 AD, 66 AD, the Romans rose in, annex any country they conquered as a province. They left Chitjian II, remained king of Armenia, but no longer king of kings. The area was reduced throughout this area. After 55 BC, when Chitjian II died, the history of Armenia became more and more complex, and became more fragmented. Now, because it was weaker, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire began meddling in the internal affairs of the Armenian kingdom. At 34 BC, Antony invaded this part, Asia Minor. Antony eventually Cleopatra. He invaded here with the purpose of subduing the Persian king, but in his way was Armenia. Antony made an alliance with the Armenian king, whose name was Artaphas. He made an alliance, and he suggested they attack the Persians together. And as a reward, the Armenian king was supposed to get certain land over here. The Armenian king, Artaphas, advised Antony to attack a certain way. Antony attacked a different way before Artaphas told him to attack, and Antony's army was destroyed by the Persians. The Armenian army never joined, and this resulted in the accusation that the Armenians had betrayed the Roman Empire. Antony sent that report saying that the Armenian king is a traitor and he betrayed us. He didn't send us his army when he was supposed to. Antony was doing this for various political reasons in Rome, to enhance himself, because no general wants to admit that he failed, he lost his army because of his own error. But what this did to Armenia was, in the long run, disastrous. Because Artaphas II, which was called gentle king, because he was supposed to be gentle, he wasn't a hardcore politician. He was invited down here by Antony to discuss various political problems. Like a fool, he went. He was captured there, and Antony and Cleopatra take the Armenian king down to Alexandria, where 2 years later he was beheaded. Before he was beheaded, he was asked to give up his throne to the Roman Empire. He refused. Then he was asked to give up his throne to the son of Antony and Cleopatra, Alexander. He refused that. Eventually, Artaphas II and his whole family were murdered down here. In 33 BC, Cleopatra and Antony installed their son, Alexander, on the Armenian throne, but he never made it. Now, this dynasty, the Chitjian dynasty, lasted until 2 AD. It's confusing, I know, but I'm skipping a lot. It lasted to 2 AD,
at which time there followed approximately 60 years of foreign domination of Armenia. There was a Median king, a Parthian Persian king, a Jewish king, and 2 Georgian kings that ruled Armenia during this period. In 54 AD, the Armenian throne went back to Armenians. And this happened because the Persians, and I'm simplifying here, this happened because the Persians and the Romans could not see eye to eye, and they wanted to have a buffer between their boundaries. This is the Persian-Roman boundary right here. Armenia was right on it. They wanted to have a buffer. The Persian king installed, at the request of the Armenian nationalists, the nationalist faction, which was opposed to Rome, the Persian king installed one of his family members, whose name was Dirtad. Dirtad I, 54 AD, he installed it. This was another dynasty called the Arshakuni dynasty. And you might read it in Western historical literature as the Arsacid dynasty. Now the Roman emperor, who at this time was Nero, he didn't like this, because now when a monarch, when a king of kings gives a king a crown, that means that he is his vassal. So immediately, Nero sent a crown also to Dirtad. So before it, the Armenians didn't have one king, now they had two kings, two crowns actually, one king but two crowns, which indicates how important these lands were for both empires. They couldn't afford one empire to take control of all of these lands because it was important strategically. The mountainous region made it a bastion, a natural fortress, and all the trade routes of the Middle East, in the ancient world ran through Armenia. The China route, like this, went through Armenia. All routes. Armenia was a hub. From the north, south, east, west, commerce came there and was sent out from there, foreign trade. This situation under Arsacids dynasty lasted until 387. But within that time, one crucial thing happened, which was the adoption of Christianity by Armenia in 301 AD. There's an interesting story around that. There are theories that Armenians adopted Christianity as a political move, not a religious move, because Christianity had existed in Armenia by 301 AD, it had existed in Armenia for about 200 years. And during that time, the Armenian kings would persecute the Christians just like the Roman emperors would persecute the Christians. So Christianity sure did not come into Armenia as an invited movement. But in 301, the political situation of Armenia again became weak. Again, the Persians and the Romans were watching very carefully Armenia, and again were jealous of its autonomy, because whenever they left Armenians to their own devices, they began to get strong. Armenia at this time was ruled, during this period of the Arshakunian dynasty, during this roughly 400 years, it was ruled by a king, but also by very powerful nobility, and nobility that was much more powerful than the nobility that we're used to in Europe. The European feudalistic order was different from the Armenian, in the sense that the Armenian feudalistic order granted the princes much autonomy, great autonomy, and too much autonomy for the good of the Armenians, because a prince would be loyal to the king only when his personal interest, the interest of his estate, suited it. Thus, what began now is that princes here were being ruled by the Romans. Princes along these borders of Armenia were being ruled by the Persians. The king was in the middle, and he saw that the monarchy saw that his hold over the princes was weak, and he needed something to bind the Armenians together, because at this time they had no written language. They had a spoken language, no written language. Their religion was pagan, as was the religion all around them pagan. There was nothing distinct about them. In 301, Gregory the Illuminator, who had been evangelizing in this area, and who had been a friend of the Armenian king of the time, whose name was Deodat III. He had been his friend formerly. Now, Deodat III asked Gregory to come to Armenia and install and implant Christianity into the country. Again, I'm simplifying it. But he didn't do this because he believed in Christianity. It was obvious. He saw in Christianity a way to bind the people together, to make the Armenians different from the surrounding peoples, to make them different, to have them have something common, something spiritual that's binding them, something to bind all these princes, these independent-minded princes. After the adoption of Christianity, there began a widespread destruction of pagan temples, pagan rites, pagan literature, and it's a shame that these overzealous Christians destroyed all this beautiful building and artifacts. There was great resistance in Armenia to Christianity. Widespread massacres of Armenians by Armenians. in the name of Christianity. Pagans did not just disappear. And afterwards, after about 325, when Christianity was firmly embedded into the country, there were pagan strongholds throughout the country which resisted. Again, Armenia is so mountainous that you could go up into, go to your perch up in a mountain, and a king would have a very hard time reaching you. So that you were able to retain considerable autonomy. These pagan groups remained for many long years in the hinterland of Armenia. Now this situation of Armenia being independent but under the sway of the two empires continued until 387 AD, at which time Persia and Rome decided to partition the country. They saw that Armenia was not serving as a buffer. A buffer serves its purpose when it can stand on its own. If one side has to support the buffer, it does no good, because then that side is taking advantage of it and can use the buffer's land to attack the other side. It was obvious that the Armenian king could not keep his kingdom together, so to make it safe, they decided to split Armenia. 4/5 went to Persia, 1/5 went to Rome. Armenia had two kings now. When this king here, Khosrow, on the west side, in smaller Armenia, when he died, the area was incorporated as a province into Rome. That was the end of that Armenia, Armenia Minor. Armenia Major remained as a kingdom until 429. After that, it became, at 429, it became a province of the Persian Empire. This was complete, total loss of independence. But about 100 years before this, before 429, another important milestone in Armenian history took place. That was the invention of the alphabet. Again, this was a political move, inventing the alphabet. Until now, Armenians have been writing with the script of the Assyrians, mostly Greek, Assyrian script. Before that, hieroglyphics. They had no alphabet of their own. Again, what binds the people together? What makes a people a people? What makes a culture a culture? One of the important things is language. Armenians did not have a written language. So in 406 AD, the Armenian king Ramshapur commissioned a man called Mesrop Mashtots, commissioned him to invent an Armenian alphabet. Immediately after this, there began an outpouring of Armenian literature. First, there were translations. For 25 years, there were translations of holy works, the Bible, into Armenian. And after that, original works began to be written in the Armenian language for the first time. And from this period, we have a lot of beautiful illuminated manuscripts. And as we look back on it, it looks like what King Ramshapur did was one of the most important things he did for the Armenians. Because now, in 429, Armenia had lost all political autonomy, all independence, and was now a province of two empires. From 429 to 885, Armenia was ruled one after another by Persians, by Rome, which became the Byzantine Empire, and in around 650 AD, Armenia for the first time got a new ruler. This time it was the Arabs. The Arab Empire, which sprang from this region in about 20 years. It expanded about 640 to 660, expanded all the way from North Africa up to southern Spain, all the way to India. It had extensive lands. It was a huge empire, but it was stopped when it reached Armenia. The Arabs invaded Armenia 3 times. The third time, they finally made inroads into the country. Until then, the first 2 times, the Armenian princes who had retained their independence, who had opposed the Armenian king before, when the Armenian king tried to centralize his authority, now these princes came to be of use to Armenia. Because just as they didn't want the Armenian king to impose his authority on themselves, they did not want Arab kings to impose their will. So the Armenians resisted. Finally, it was subjugated. But Armenia was the only area in the whole Arab Empire that was not ruled directly by the Caliph. There was always an Armenian intermediary, or Armenian governors, and eventually, after 200 years of this type of situation where the Armenian nobility was ruling the country and paying taxes, paying duty and allegiance and soldiers to the Arab Empire, in 885, another Armenian dynasty, this time called the Bagratuni dynasty, they established another kingdom. This was by the will, I should say by the grace of the Arab and Byzantine emperors. Again, just like it had happened with Nero in 54 AD, right now in 85 AD, same thing, where one Armenian prince, whose name was Ashot, became so prominent, so powerful, that he rallied around him all the Armenian princes, and he was able to get strong enough, get powerful enough, so that the Arabs were obliged to give him a crown. Again, immediately the Byzantines recognized this king, and they also gave him a crown. Again, Armenians had 2 crowns. This kingdom lasted from 885 to 1045. This is called the Kingdom of Ani, which this is the Bagratid Armenian Kingdom of Ani. The capital was right here. The capital right now is right on the Turkish-Soviet border. And there are beautiful ruins over there, Armenian churches, fortresses. And from Soviet Armenia, when you look across, you can see the ruins. You get close enough. You're not allowed to get close enough really for military purposes. You can see Ani over here. And it's a cruel joke of history that Ani was placed right on the border for Armenians to look at, and like a child having a toy in front of him and he can't touch it because there's a piece of glass in front of it. In 1045 AD, Byzantium attacked Armenia. Again, this king was getting too powerful, the country was getting too strong. Again, the Byzantine king attacked. In 1045, the kingdom of Ani fell. But the Byzantines were foolish, because at this time, over here, by 1045, the Arab Empire had declined. It was no longer powerful. And the Arab caliphs had begun importing Turks, Seljuk various Turkish tribes. They had begun importing them from Central Asia to fight as their frontline soldiers. They call them Ghazis, pointmen, in other words. They would invade new territory, make the territory safe for the Arab forces to come in. Well, eventually, when the Arab Empire, when the central authority of the Caliph disintegrated, the Turks, who had formed a palace guard around the Caliph, took over. At this time, around 1064, Turkish tribes began moving this way toward Armenia, and now what they saw was a desolate land, because just 2 years previously there had been a war there. It was decimated, and all the fortifications that the Armenian princes had set up had been destroyed by the Byzantines, and the Byzantines now had not gotten used to the terrain yet. Who can defend your home better than yourself? They had left this whole area unmanned. The Seljuk Turks came and very easily were able to reconquer from Byzantium the kingdom of Ani. On historic Armenian land, which is here, that was the last Armenian kingdom, last Armenian political entity until 1918. But here, in this part of Asia Minor, which is called Cilicia, which is not where the Armenians had been in earlier times, here another state was formed. Armenian princes, nobility that had been pushed out because of wars, devastation, and who had been bought out by the Byzantines. They would come to prince and say, I'll buy your estate, and I'll give you a better lands here, greener lands here. And he would come to it's like block buying in real estate today. They would come and they would take, they took the estates of 4 princes like this over here. They were making inroads into the Armenian kingdom. As a result of this, there were a lot of Armenian nobility gathered over here in this very beautiful, green, fertile land. In 1198, the Armenians were able to, these princes were able to establish another kingdom under the dynasty called the Rupenids. At this time, the Crusades, you recall the Crusades are taking place throughout this period, and the Crusades are coming like this, from southern Asia Minor, down here right through Armenia, and into the Holy Land. So again, Armenia, this new kingdom of Armenia Cilicia, became of strategic importance to the Crusaders, and hence to the enemies of the Crusaders, the Mamluks, for example, in Egypt. The Armenians, the Rupenid dynasty of Armenia established strong ties with the European nobility, and thought that by having ties with the European nobility, that they could get the Europeans to support their independence, especially since they were helping the Crusaders. Whenever they would feed the Crusaders, they would. This was like a sanctuary. After a battle, the Crusaders would fight somewhere. Their forces would often go into Armenia for sanctuary. That was the only ally they had in the area. But in 1375, this kingdom also fell to the Mamluks of Egypt, who came up here. This kingdom fell. Now, from 1575 to 1918, Armenia remained under total domination, no autonomy, no political recognition at all. Armenia from 1575 to 1918 is divided between the 3 empires. First, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which held this part of Armenia. Persian Empire, Persia held this part, and in 1826, for the first time, part of Armenia came under Russian control. Russian forces came down in 1826. They defeated the Persian forces, and General Paskevich of Russian forces was able to attract enough Armenians from here to move with them back into this area, which at that time was called the Yerevan province, which is one province of Persia. Now, this province, Yerevan province, became a part of the Russian Empire. Many Armenians, thousands, tens of thousands, moved back with this Russian general into this province. 3 years following, there was a war, Russian-Turkish war. Russian forces came up to here. They made a peace, however, and Russia did not take any land. But 100,000 Armenians again went with the Russian general into Russia. Again, they're thinking, Armenians are thinking that since Russia is a Christian power, will fare better in there. So Persia and Turkey, being Muslim, they were being persecuted throughout the 400 or 500 years. They're constantly being persecuted. They thought they'd be safer under the Russian Tsar. But soon they were proven wrong because the Tsar gave them no autonomy, no political recognition, and he incorporated Armenia not even as a province, and we lowered the status to he broke up the Yerevan province into small, fragmented cantons or counties. So again, the central power of Armenia was broken up. And this situation remained in 1826 until the First World War. In the First World War, before the First World War, in 1860, beginning in 1860, there was a cultural revival among Armenians.
Recall that during 500 years they were under domination. The only thing they had to cling to was the Armenian church and their literature. There was no avenue of political outlet. But after the French Revolution, many Armenians, wealthy Armenian families, who had come to this area, to the capital, the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul, to at that time city of Smyrna, they come here. And these families had become very prominent in commerce, in foreign trade, and hence they became very wealthy. They began sending their children, their sons, to Europe. When their sons returned, they came back not only with knowledge, technical knowledge, but they came back with political ideology that was absent in Armenia, political consciousness. And they came back in the mid to later 19th century, and they saw the condition of their people. And they don't like it, and they demanded political entity, political recognition by the Ottoman government. From 1860 to 1914, Armenians progressively became more vocal in their demands. What they were demanding was autonomy. For the historical land, they were demanding autonomy, not independence. To achieve this autonomy, various political parties were formed. One was Chitjian, formed in 1890 in Tiflis. But it's interesting that the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which is Chitjian, was formed on Russian land, but its activities were directed toward the Ottoman Empire. They claimed to have no grievance with the Tsar. But in 1902, the Tsar made a mistake. He confiscated the lands of the Armenian Church. Until now, the Armenian Church has been the only entity, Armenian entity that retains any sort of self-governing powers. And the Armenian Church is extremely wealthy. And wealth in the church, lands, wealth, spiritual strength can be dangerous to North Africa. So in 1903, the lands of the Armenian Church, all the property were confiscated. Now, the Armenian revolutionaries directed their activity not only against the Sultan, the Turkish Sultan, but also against the Russian Tsar. As World War I approached, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation and most Armenians feared that a war being fought here. I should explain that in the First World War, Turkey was on one side, on the side of Germany. Russia was on the side of the Allies. So any war between these enemies was going to take place again on Armenian lands. And Armenians know the history of their home being used as a battleground. So again, their population would be decimated. Again, the land would be destroyed. So the Armenian leaders, the leadership at that time, did not want Turkey to enter the war. There was one other reason. In 1914, through great finagling, through great pressure, the Armenians were able to convince the Sultan, convince the young government of Turkey that the Armenians should have a some amount of autonomy. And this edict would be destroyed. This granting of autonomy, which was a big gain, 500-600 years, this is the biggest gain they made. If Turkey entered the war, all might be lost. So the Armenians were on the side of peace. Now I should go back 10 years, 1896. This activity of the Armenians, this increasingly vocal demand for autonomy, for self-governing rights, created suspicion, understandably, among the government of Turkey. Created great suspicion, and it led to repressive acts on the part of the government. Beginning in 1895, there were widespread massacres down here, across this region of Armenia, and even in the capital city. in 1896, a group of Armenian revolutionaries who wanted to attract the eyes of Europe to the plight of the Armenians decided to do an old version of the modern takeover of a building. They took over the Ottoman Bank. The Bank of the Ottoman Empire was at that time an extremely important financial institution, and in it were a lot of European employees. And the Armenians thought that if they could control this bank, they could seize it, they could demand from Europe intercession on behalf of the Armenians. Well, this episode was funny. They took over the Ottoman Bank, and most of the leaders were killed before they got inside the bank. Once they got inside, it was chaos. They didn't know what they were doing. And eventually, some sharp ambassadors, the Russian and British ambassadors, were able to convince these Armenian revolutionaries to come out. They promised them, we'll give you this, we'll give you that, if you come out. Well, the Armenians believed them, and it's interesting, once they came out, they were taken onto, the only promise they got was amnesty for themselves. They got no promise of reforms, no nothing. Once they were taken out onto the yacht of the British ambassador, now they began to show their courage. The ambassador said whoever comes on the ambassadorial ship has to forfeit his weapons. You cannot carry weapons on the ship of the ambassador. Now the Armenian revolutionaries got very brave. They said, no, Armenians don't give up their guns. The Russian ambassador who was there was smart. He must have known Armenians. He said, we'll buy them from you. And the revolution, okay, they sold it. Now they were satisfied. These revolutionaries, by the way, they did get amnesty and nothing else. Again, the incident blew over, and what it showed was that Europe is not going to intervene for you unless their interests are tied. But the Armenians learned this very slowly, and because they didn't learn this lesson, it led to widespread massacres in 1915. Early in the war, 1914, the Ottoman Empire finally did enter the war against the suggestion of the Armenians. Early 1914, the Ottoman army attacked this way toward Russia. But unfortunately, they picked the fall, and they became caught in the winter. And the Armenian plateau, this whole area is a high plateau, and it gets very cold in winter. And the Turkish troops were not ready for a long campaign. Their forces over here were defeated, annihilated by the Russian troops, and they retreated. They retreated en masse all the way back up to here. Now again, just like when Antony invaded Armenia and he lost his army, he blamed the Armenian king and had the Armenian king beheaded. This time again, the Turkish general, who didn't want to admit that he lost the army, he lost about 190,000 men in this campaign, and it was one of the largest armies of the Ottoman Empire. He lost the whole thing. He said that he lost his campaign because the Armenians were helping the Russian troops. And indeed, there were Armenians helping the Russian troops, because on this side, on the Russian side, there was, after all, part of Armenia called the Yerevan province. The Russians were using the Armenians as volunteer groups, volunteer contingents to attack ahead, to scout the area, because they knew the language of the area and they were more familiar. And there were Ottoman Armenians, citizens of the Turkish Empire, who also were helping the Russians. As in every war, there are traitors, there are agents and counter-agents on both sides. But the people of the Armenian plateau had nothing to do with this campaign here. They tried to get out of the way, and it didn't help. The Russian troops advanced all the way up to Erzurum,
They advanced all the way up to here. But before they advanced, something happened. The rulers of Turkey, who had already been afraid, they had been apprehensive about the presence of 1.5 million Armenians in this area. 2 million in the whole empire, whole Turkish empire, 1.5 million in this area, maybe 1 million, it's hard to say. They were afraid of their increasing demands for autonomy. And now, with these rumors, with this fabrication that the Armenians stabbed the Turkish army in the back, the Turkey, which was ruled by a triumvirate at that time, whose leader was a man named Talat Pasha, organized a deportation of the Armenians. They decided to remove the Armenians from the area under the pretext that it's a war zone, and in a war zone you should have the area clear of the inhabitants, so you can conduct your campaign in ease. In April of 1915, in the capital, 200 Armenian intellectuals were arrested and executed at various times, various parts of the country. One of them was a member of parliament of Turkey. And that was the beginning of these deportation massacres, which eventually evolved into a genocide. And briefly, this is what happened. The Armenian, I should skip over this very quickly because there's another.
Right, we're going to have one day on the genocide.
Right, I just.
We'll go into depth.
Right, I'll just sum up briefly.